Slavery in the North, what they never told you. Why were men and women still enslaved in New Jersey decades after America called itself free? How did Wall Street bankers and Northern Railroad tycoons grow rich from human bondage, while their politicians condemned it in speeches? And how could the streets of abolitionist Boston echo with the sound of chains in 1854? These are not the stories most textbooks tell. But later in this video, you'll see the truth hidden behind the myth of a free North. Shocking events, forgotten betrayals, and deals that tied Northern wealth to Southern slavery. Stay with me, because the answers will change how you see the 19th century. The North's quiet chains, slavery after 1800. Have you ever been told that the North was always free? That once the Revolution ended, slavery simply vanished above the Mason-Dixon line? The truth is more troubling. Slavery lingered in the North well into the 19th century, hidden behind legal tricks and quiet compromises. And the question is, why don't we hear about it? Start with New Jersey. In 1804, the state passed a law for gradual emancipation. Sounds noble, right? But here's the catch. Any enslaved child born after that year had to serve the mother's master until adulthood. Boys until age 25, girls until 21. In other words, slavery had not ended. It had just been renamed. Those already enslaved remained in bondage for life. Freedom was promised to the next generation, but only after decades of labor. Imagine being told your child might be free someday, but you would die enslaved. That was the New Jersey system. Connecticut and Rhode Island tried the same path. Gradual emancipation laws allowed slavery to technically fade away over decades. But gradual often meant never. In 1810, Connecticut still had more than 300 enslaved people. And as late as 1840, New Jersey reported over 600 people still legally enslaved. Some of them were older men and women who had been born before the laws, trapped until death. A cruel legal trick extended their chains far beyond what the public was told. Why would northern states, supposedly free, keep slavery alive? The answer is both simple and unsettling: money. Even when northern families owned only a few slaves, those enslaved people represented labor, wealth, and status. In New York, wealthy households used enslaved workers as domestic servants well into the early 1800s. In fact, New York did not fully abolish slavery until 1827. And on the day before emancipation took effect, enslavers rushed to sell off men and women to buyers in the South, cashing out while they still could. So much for the land of liberty. But the hypocrisy ran deeper. Northern leaders often spoke loudly against slavery in the South while protecting it at home. Take Vermont, often praised for being the first state to ban slavery in its 1777 Constitution. Yet historians now point out that Vermont's ban was never strongly enforced. Wealthy families quietly held people in servitude under other names, such as indenture. They found loopholes, and authorities looked away. Was this freedom, or just a new disguise for bondage? Have you heard of the perpetual slaves of Pennsylvania? That state passed a gradual emancipation law in 1780, yet slavery persisted into the 19th century. Children of enslaved mothers had to serve until age 28. In some cases, that meant 2 full generations lived and died in bondage after the law was passed. The records are clear. In 1840, decades after the supposed end, there were still men and women in Pennsylvania legally enslaved. How many schoolbooks ever mention that? Even as slavery slowly declined, the North found new ways to profit from the institution. Many enslaved men and women were sold southward, where demand was booming on cotton plantations. This created a quiet but steady trade from north to south. Families that had kept a few household slaves no longer needed them in the age of wage labor, so they sold them. The people were treated like surplus furniture, moved south for cash. The story of slavery in the North is also the story of silence. Northern newspapers rarely printed runaway slave ads by the 1830s, but that was not because the practice had ended. It was because it embarrassed the image of a free North. Yet behind closed doors, Northern courts still enforced slave laws. Judges in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania routinely upheld the rights of enslavers and punished fugitives. Freedom on paper did not always mean freedom in practice. Let's pause and ask, why is this forgotten? Why are Northern chains hidden in the shadows of history? One reason is the Civil War. After 1865, the North claimed the moral high ground. Schoolbooks portrayed the Union as the land of liberty, fighting to free the slaves in the South. But telling the full truth would have meant admitting the North's own complicity. The story was rewritten to fit a cleaner narrative. And generations of Americans grew up believing slavery was a Southern sin alone. But history is not that neat. Consider this fact. In the 1830 census, more than 2,000 enslaved people were still counted in northern states. 2,000, decades after America declared itself a nation of liberty. Some were elderly women, still tied to the same families they had served since youth. Others were children born into bondage despite laws promising gradual freedom. Their lives were not the footnote our textbooks suggest. They were the lived reality of Northern slavery. So here's the question for you. If the North held on to slavery for so long, was it really that different from the South? Yes, the scale was smaller, fewer plantations, fewer enslaved overall. But in principle, bondage is bondage. The Northern states clung to it when it suited them, then abandoned it only when social and economic change made it less useful. That is the part of the story we are rarely told. Later in this video, we will uncover how this same hypocrisy carried forward, not just in hidden slavery, but in open complicity. Northern banks, factories, and politicians found ways to thrive off the Southern slave system, even as they claimed to oppose it. But before we go there, it is important to sit with this simple truth. The North was not always free, and in the early 19th century, thousands of men and women still lived as slaves, on Northern soil, under Northern law. What would you have thought, living in New Jersey in 1820, walking past an enslaved man on the street while your leaders called America the land of the free? Would you have looked away? Or would you have spoken up? The North's chains were quieter, but no less real. And now you know the story behind them. The last slave sale in New Jersey, 1804. What would you think if I told you that a northern state, long after the Revolution, staged a public sale of enslaved people in the 19th century? Would you believe it? Many imagined that by 1800, slavery in the North was just a memory. But in New Jersey, it was still business as usual. And in 1804, a final sale took place that would become a symbol of the state's quiet resistance to freedom. New Jersey is often called the reluctant emancipator. While most northern states were slowly phasing out slavery after the Revolution, New Jersey held on. In 1804, the legislature passed a law promising gradual emancipation. That sounds good on paper, but the fine print told a different story. Children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th of that year would technically be free, but only after decades of servitude. Boys would remain bound until age 25, girls until 21. That meant slavery could stretch far into the century. So what happened in 1804? In a township not far from the Delaware River, a family advertised the sale of several enslaved people. The notice was blunt. A man in his 30s, a young woman, and 2 children were listed for auction. Buyers were told the adults were healthy, loyal, and accustomed to labor. The children were valued as future workers. The sale was not hidden. It was announced in a local paper, just like the sale of horses or farmland. That was the reality of freedom in New Jersey. Think about the timing. America had already fought a war for liberty, adopted the Constitution, and seen states like Massachusetts declare slavery incompatible with natural rights. Yet here in 1804, in a northern state, human beings were still bought and sold. And nobody stopped it. The 1804 sale was not technically the last sale in practice. Records show that private transactions continued for years after. But this public auction stood out because of its date. Legislators had just passed a law promising freedom. Yet even as they wrote it, families like this one were selling men, women, and children for profit. It was a cruel contradiction, a reminder that laws on paper do not always mean change in life. Why did New Jersey resist freedom so strongly? The answer lies in economics and culture. New Jersey's farms were smaller than the South's great plantations, but many relied on enslaved labor for daily work. Dairy farming, grain production, and domestic service all depended on it. Families who owned only 1 or 2 enslaved people still saw them as essential to survival. Ending slavery outright would have meant economic sacrifice, and few were willing to take that step. But money was not the only factor. Politics mattered too. New Jersey was wedged between Philadelphia and New York, both centers of commerce tied to Southern trade. Slaveholding families feared being left behind in a region where slavery was already shrinking. Yet at the same time, they did not want to appear openly defiant. So they embraced gradual emancipation, slow enough to protect their interests, but fast enough to keep up appearances. The 1804 law was a compromise, but a compromise at the expense of the enslaved. Let's look at what that meant for real people. Imagine being the young woman sold in that 1804 auction. If she had children after July 4th of that year, they would be bound until adulthood. She would live out her life enslaved, while watching her children serve the same master for decades. Yes, freedom might come eventually, but not for her. And maybe not for them, if they were sold south before reaching their 20s. That is not freedom, it is a slow-motion theft of liberty. The hypocrisy grew sharper as decades passed. In 1820, census records show over 10,000 black residents of New Jersey, and hundreds were still enslaved. By 1840, nearly 700 people remained in bondage. Some were elderly men and women, born before 1804, trapped for life. Others were children still serving their mothers' masters, waiting for the day they might finally be free. The 1804 law promised change, but the reality was delay. And here's a fact that may surprise you. New Jersey was the last northern state to abolish slavery. Not until the Civil War era did slavery finally die there. In fact, during the 1860 census, right on the eve of war, 18 people in New Jersey were still legally enslaved. 18 souls, held as property in a Union state, as the nation prepared to fight a war over slavery. So what do we make of that 1804 sale? It is more than just a forgotten transaction. It is a symbol of Northern hypocrisy. While many celebrated the Revolution's promise of liberty, others clung to bondage until the last possible moment. New Jersey's sale of human beings in 1804 reveals how deep those chains ran, even in states that called themselves free. Why is this important today? Because history is often cleaned up. Schoolbooks tell us that slavery was a Southern problem, while the North stood proudly against it. But the truth is harder. The North had its own chains, its own sales, its own betrayals of liberty. And if we do not tell those stories, we are not telling the full story at all. Later in this video, we will turn to another betrayal, one that shook even the most abolitionist city in America. In 1854, Boston, the supposed stronghold of liberty, sent a man back into slavery. But before we get there, remember this: freedom delayed is freedom denied. And for the men, women, and children sold in New Jersey in 1804, liberty was promised, but never delivered. The Boston Betrayal, the Anthony Burns Case, 1854. What would you think if I told you that Boston, the cradle of liberty, once marched a man in chains through its streets, sending him back to slavery under armed guard? This was not the South. This was not before the Revolution. This was 1854, in the heart of abolitionist New England. And the man's name was Anthony Burns. Anthony Burns was born into slavery in Virginia. In 1853, at the age of 20, he made his escape. Like many fugitives, he hoped the North would offer safety. He reached Boston, a city proud of its abolitionist reputation. There, he found work in a clothing shop, trying to live quietly. But freedom was fragile under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That law required northern states to return escaped slaves to their owners, even if they had reached free soil. And it gave federal marshals the power to seize fugitives anywhere, at any time. In May 1854, Burns was betrayed. His former master, Charles Suttle, learned of his whereabouts and sent men to claim him. Federal officers arrested Burns on the streets of Boston. The news spread quickly, and outrage followed. Here was Boston, the city of John Adams and the abolitionist press, being forced to enforce slavery. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse where Burns was held. Angry speeches rang out. Some called for direct action. On the night of May 26th, a mob stormed the courthouse. Armed with axes and clubs, they tried to break Burns free. Shots were fired. A guard was killed. The attempt failed, and Burns remained inside. The government responded with overwhelming force. President Franklin Pierce, eager to prove the Fugitive Slave Act would be enforced, ordered troops into the city. Imagine the scene. Streets filled with federal soldiers, cannons, and armed police. Shops closed their doors. Church bells tolled in protest. Yet the law stood firm. On June 2nd, Anthony Burns was marched from the courthouse to the harbor, surrounded by more than 1,000 troops. Bystanders lined the streets. Some wept, some shouted, some stood in stunned silence. At the water's edge, Burns was placed aboard a ship and sent back to Virginia, to slavery. Boston had betrayed its own ideals. The same city that had sparked the Revolution, that claimed liberty as its birthright, had bowed to the demands of the slave system. For many, it was a moment of shame. The image of Burns, shackled and guarded by soldiers, burned itself into memory. Abolitionists declared it proof that no northern state was truly free while the Fugitive Slave Act stood. Why does this story matter? Because it reveals the North's divided soul. Many Northerners hated slavery in theory, but when faced with the law, they complied. Business interests feared Southern backlash. Politicians feared disunion. Ordinary citizens feared violence. So they allowed Anthony Burns to be dragged back into bondage. Yet the story did not end there. Burns's case transformed Boston. Public outrage grew stronger after his deportation. Within months, Northern abolitionists raised money to purchase his freedom. By 1855, Burns was free again, this time legally, and he later studied for the ministry. His life became a testimony to resilience. But the shame of his arrest lingered in Boston's memory. The case also hardened national divisions. In the South, slaveholders celebrated the enforcement of the law. They saw proof that the federal government would defend their property rights, even in hostile northern cities. In the North, resistance deepened. More citizens, even moderates, began to see the Fugitive Slave Act as intolerable. Newspapers printed fiery condemnations. Churches denounced the law from the pulpit. The case of Anthony Burns made it clear: compromise with slavery meant submission to it. Let's pause here. What would you have done, standing in that Boston crowd? Would you have joined the mob storming the courthouse? Would you have shouted at the soldiers as they marched Burns down State Street? Or would you have looked away, afraid of the law, afraid of the consequences? Many Bostonians looked away, but enough remembered the shame to carry it forward. Later in this video, we will see that Burns's story was not an exception. Northern states often bent the knee when federal law demanded it, and the Fugitive Slave Act turned even free states into hunting grounds. Freedom in the North was fragile, conditional, and always under threat. The case of Anthony Burns was the most dramatic reminder. The irony is hard to miss. Boston celebrated itself as a city of liberty, home to the Sons of Liberty, the Boston Tea Party, and fiery speeches about natural rights. Yet in 1854, its streets hosted a different kind of procession, one man in chains, guarded by soldiers, sent back to slavery. The Revolution's city had betrayed its promise. In the years that followed, the Burns case became a rallying cry. Abolitionists used it to prove that slavery poisoned not only the South, but the entire nation. The Fugitive Slave Act forced Northerners to participate in the system they claimed to despise. And in doing so, it exposed the great lie that the North was fully innocent. Anthony Burns never asked to be a symbol. He only wanted freedom. Yet his struggle revealed the truth of his time. Liberty was fragile, and even in Boston, the cradle of freedom, the chains of slavery could still be heard. The New York draft riots of 1863. What happens when a city known for progress erupts in violence so brutal that it leaves hundreds dead, neighborhoods in ashes, and a reputation scarred for generations? That is exactly what happened in New York City in July of 1863. And the target of the rage was not only the government, but also black citizens who had nothing to do with the draft law that sparked the fury. The Civil War was at its height. Union armies bled in the fields of Pennsylvania and Virginia. To fill the ranks, Congress passed the Conscription Act of 1863, the first federal draft in American history. But there was a catch. Wealthy men could buy their way out of service by paying $300 or hiring a substitute. $300 was a fortune for working-class immigrants. For many, it was more than a year's wages. To the Irish laborer barely scraping by, the message was clear: the poor will fight, while the rich will buy their safety. On July 11, 1863, draft officials began drawing names in New York City. The tension was already thick. Many Irish immigrants feared that the war, now openly tied to emancipation after Lincoln's proclamation, would free slaves who would then migrate north to compete for scarce jobs. 2 days later, on July 13th, anger exploded into violence. Crowds stormed the draft office on 3rd Avenue, smashing windows and setting the building ablaze. The draft was suspended, but the mobs were only beginning. For 4 days, New York became a war zone. Armed mobs roamed the streets, attacking police, looting shops, and burning buildings. But their rage turned most viciously toward black citizens. Men, women, and children were beaten in the streets. Black-owned businesses were destroyed. The Colored Orphan Asylum, home to over 200 children, was torched to the ground. Miraculously, the children escaped, but the building was lost. Why this hatred? Many Irish immigrants saw black workers as rivals for low-paying jobs, already scarce in the crowded city. Politicians had stoked these fears for years, warning that emancipation would flood the North with freed slaves. When the draft law appeared, it was the spark that lit a powder keg. Class resentment and racial animosity fused into one deadly riot. The violence shocked the nation. Mobs lynched black men in broad daylight. One victim was dragged through the streets before being hanged. Another was mutilated. Black dockworkers fled the city or hid with sympathetic neighbors. Whole families vanished from neighborhoods overnight, seeking safety wherever they could find it. By the end, the riots had killed at least 120 people, though some historians say the true number was far higher. The response was brutal. Union troops, fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg, were rushed into New York. Soldiers fired volleys into crowds, killing rioters in the streets. Cannons were positioned at key intersections. Order was finally restored by force, but the scars lingered long after the smoke cleared. The draft riots revealed something ugly about the North. For all its claims of moral superiority, New York City had shown how deeply racism and class resentment ran. While the war was supposedly fought to preserve the Union and end slavery, here was the Union's largest city tearing itself apart, targeting its black citizens with cruelty that mirrored Southern mobs. And yet, the story gets more complicated. Not every New Yorker joined the violence. Some Irish families sheltered black neighbors. Some white policemen and firefighters fought valiantly to defend black citizens and property, even against overwhelming mobs. Courage existed alongside cowardice. But the overall picture was one of betrayal. For 4 days, the Empire City revealed its darkest heart. Let's stop and ask, what would you have done? If you were an Irish immigrant, barely surviving on pennies, would you have joined the mobs, lashing out in anger at those even poorer than you? If you were a black resident, watching neighbors murdered in the streets, would you have fled or stood your ground? These are not easy questions, but they force us to confront the choices real people faced in July 1863. The draft riots also left a political legacy. Many Democrats in New York had opposed Lincoln's war policies, and the riots gave critics ammunition. They argued that the draft was unfair, that emancipation would bring chaos, and that the government cared more about freed slaves than struggling white workers. Meanwhile, Republicans used the riots as proof that slavery had poisoned the entire nation, infecting even free states with hatred and division. The riots also changed the city itself. Afterward, many black residents left New York for good, reducing the city's black population for years. The communities that survived lived under a shadow of fear, their safety never again taken for granted. And the memory of the riots haunted Irish immigrants too, branding them with a reputation for lawlessness and racism that would take generations to overcome. Later in this video, we will uncover how Northern business leaders, while riots raged in the streets, were making secret deals with the South to keep profits flowing. But first, remember this. The New York draft riots were not just about the draft. They were about fear, resentment, and the deep fault lines of race and class in America. When we think of Civil War violence, we picture Gettysburg or Antietam. But for 4 bloody days in July 1863, the battlefield was the streets of New York, and the enemy was not across a line of muskets. It was neighbor against neighbor, citizen against citizen. Lincoln's gamble, the Corwin Amendment. When most people think of Abraham Lincoln, they picture the great emancipator, the president who ended slavery. But here is a question you may not have heard before. Did Lincoln once support protecting slavery forever? The answer is yes. And the story of the Corwin Amendment reveals just how close America came to preserving bondage in the Constitution itself. It was 1861. The nation was breaking apart. 7 Southern states had already seceded after Lincoln's election. War seemed inevitable, but many in Washington still hoped for compromise, a last-minute deal to hold the Union together. Out of that desperation came the Corwin Amendment. Introduced by Representative Thomas Corwin of Ohio, the proposal aimed to calm the South by guaranteeing that Congress would never interfere with slavery where it already existed. The language was blunt. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere with domestic institutions, including persons held to labor or service. In plain words, it would lock slavery into the Constitution permanently. Here's the shocking part. Abraham Lincoln did not oppose it. In his first inaugural address, delivered in March 1861, Lincoln mentioned the amendment. He said he had no objection to it, believing it might reassure the South and prevent further secession. He even ordered copies of the amendment sent to every state governor. The man, remembered for freeing the slaves, had once been willing to preserve slavery forever, if that meant saving the Union. Why would Lincoln do this? The answer lies in his priorities at the time. In early 1861, Lincoln's goal was not emancipation, it was preservation. He believed the Union had to survive at all costs. To him, slavery was wrong, but secession was worse. He calculated that if protecting slavery where it already existed could keep border states like Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri from leaving, it was a price worth paying. But imagine the consequences if the Corwin Amendment had succeeded. Slavery would have been shielded by the Constitution itself, beyond the reach of Congress or future amendments. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in 1865, could never have passed. Millions of enslaved men and women might have remained in bondage for decades longer. America's destiny would have been altered beyond recognition. So why do we not hear more about this? One reason is that the amendment failed. Though Congress approved it in March 1861, only a handful of states ratified it. Then Fort Sumter fell, war erupted, and the compromise became meaningless. Secessionists were not interested in half measures. They wanted independence, not guarantees. The Corwin Amendment was left to gather dust, forgotten in the storm of war. But failure does not erase the fact that it came close. Several states, including Ohio and Maryland, did ratify the amendment before the war. In fact, it was never officially revoked. To this day, it technically remains pending, though irrelevant after the passage of the real 13th Amendment. History nearly took a very different path. Critics later used the Corwin Amendment to argue that Lincoln was not the pure liberator schoolbooks made him out to be. They point out that in 1861, Lincoln was cautious, even conservative, about slavery. His first priority was always the Union, not abolition. Only as the war dragged on, and only under immense pressure, did he shift toward emancipation. The Corwin Amendment reminds us that leaders are often more complex than their legends. Let's pause and ask, if you were Lincoln in 1861, what would you have done? Would you have risked war to strike at slavery immediately, knowing it might tear the Union apart completely? Or would you have tried compromise, even if it meant preserving the very system you opposed? Lincoln chose compromise first, war second, and emancipation only later. History often forgets the order. The Corwin Amendment also reveals something deeper about the North. For all the talk of liberty, many Northerners were perfectly willing to protect slavery in order to avoid conflict. The amendment passed Congress with bipartisan support. Leaders in both parties signed on, believing the Union mattered more than freedom for the enslaved. That truth does not fit neatly into the myth of the noble North versus the evil South. But history rarely fits myths. In the end, the Corwin Amendment became a footnote, overshadowed by the war that followed. But it deserves attention. It shows us how fragile freedom was, how easily it could have been postponed or erased. If events had turned only slightly differently, America's Constitution might have enshrined slavery forever. And the man we remember as the great emancipator might be remembered instead as the president who saved the Union by chaining millions more lives to bondage. Later in this video, we will look at another Northern compromise, this one not in Congress, but in business. While Lincoln and politicians debated amendments, Northern railroad tycoons were cutting deals with Southern planters to keep profits rolling in. But before we turn there, remember this. Liberty in 1861 was not inevitable. It was contested, fragile, and very nearly lost to compromise. The Corwin Amendment is proof. America stood at the crossroads of history, and for a brief moment, the path chosen was not freedom, but the preservation of slavery itself. The railroad and the slave South. When we picture the 19th century railroad boom, the common image is one of progress. Gleaming engines, new frontiers, and northern industry marching forward. But beneath the triumph was a hidden truth. Railroads in the North were deeply tied to slavery in the South. The tracks that carried goods across the nation also carried the profits of bondage. And Northern tycoons were willing partners, striking deals with Southern planters while Northern politicians condemned slavery in public. By the 1830s and 1840s, the railroad network was spreading across the North, linking ports, markets, and industrial towns. Railroads became the lifeblood of the economy, the veins through which America's commerce pulsed. What filled the cars was not just coal, timber, or wheat. It was the South's cash crops, grown by enslaved hands. Cotton was the single most valuable export in the nation, and it traveled northward by rail. Tobacco, rice, and sugar followed. Every mile of track laid in the antebellum years drew the economies of North and South closer together. New York City, the financial capital of the country, stood at the center of this exchange. By the mid-19th century, its docks were overflowing with cotton from the South. Those bales did not arrive by chance. They were shipped by railroad lines built and financed by Northern investors. Merchants, bankers, and rail bosses all took their cut. The profits were staggering. By 1860, nearly two-thirds of America's exports were cotton, and nearly every bale traveled on rails connected to Northern capital. The North's prosperity, though cloaked in industry and finance, was in many ways an extension of Southern slavery. The connections were not abstract. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, one of the country's oldest lines, relied heavily on Southern trade. Tobacco, grain, and cotton from slave states filled its cars, bound for Northern markets. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest corporation of its day, openly hauled slave-grown cotton. These companies were not neutral carriers. They were arteries feeding a national economy sustained by enslaved labor. Northern businessmen went further still. They invested directly in the South, financing track construction that tied plantations to ports. In some cases, railroad companies built spurs leading straight to plantation gates, designed to move cotton with maximum efficiency. Enslaved men themselves were sometimes treated as collateral. A planter could pledge human beings to secure credit for a rail extension. The deal suited both sides. The planter gained faster transport. The railroad gained profit. The enslaved remained voiceless property. This history matters because it undermines the simple divide taught for generations. The story of a virtuous, free North battling an evil, slaveholding South collapses under closer inspection. Northern factories spun Southern cotton into cloth. Northern banks insured slave ships and extended credit secured by human beings. And Northern railroads carried the crops that made slavery so profitable. The myth of innocence gave way to a darker reality. Railroad tycoons themselves made no secret of their priorities. Progress, they said, was measured in miles of track, in profits tallied, in cargo delivered. Morality was not on the timetable. If the South produced the cotton, the North would haul it. The iron horse cared little for chains. Abolitionist newspapers noticed. In the 1850s, fiery editors warned that Northern industry was married to the lash. Their charges were not exaggerated. For every sermon preached in New England against the evils of slavery, there were contracts signed in boardrooms that tied Northern fortunes to Southern bondage. Politicians, aware of this dependence, often remained quiet. To confront slavery was to risk disrupting the flow of goods and money. Silence, for many, was the safer path. The Civil War revealed the depth of these entanglements. At the war's outbreak, Northern railroads panicked over lost Southern business. Profits collapsed as Union blockades cut off cotton exports. The same companies that had depended on slave-grown crops scrambled for alternatives. Many turned to Washington, lobbying for federal contracts to transport troops and supplies. Railroads that once hauled cotton now hauled soldiers. Engines that enriched themselves through bondage now powered the Union war effort. This irony was not lost on observers. Engines that had once carried the fruits of slavery now carried the men sent to end it. The transformation was sudden, but it did not erase the past. The wealth accumulated through decades of Southern trade had already built the railroads into giants. The North entered the war not only with factories, but also with a transportation network strengthened by years of profiting from slavery. That infrastructure, tainted though it was, became one of the Union's greatest strategic advantages.